Yes, hello everyone. Morning. It's really early here. And thank you very much, Juliette, for that introduction. I'm gonna go if you like, a level lower, in the sense that I'm looking more at the way in which epistemologies and ontological assumptions influence C users' behaviors and influence policy, and they have then pragmatic consequences for the achievement of particular conservation objectives. And the title, because my work, marine work, is primarily around England, I have examples from English marine protected areas. But before getting into that, I wanted to introduce some of the concepts that I'm going to use today. And apologies for my voice, but I was hoping to feel better by now, which I do, but I still have COVID, so I'm not particularly clear with my voice. Hopefully you can understand me fine. So first of all, I wanted to start off by saying something that is very basic, which is that a lot of environmental law, most of environmental law really, as well as policy, rely on natural sciences for setting objectives and targets, okay? So biology is really a very, very important component of environmental law and policy. At the same time, we've seen in recent decades that there's been more and more emphasis on including other knowledges into decision making. And if these in the 80s, 1980s seemed to be quite novel, it's now really very popular to have other knowledges included. And here I've put a few examples of conventions, so international legal instruments, as well as international policy instruments, such as sustainable development goals, that really show that we need to get to grips with other knowledges, and we need to include other knowledges when we come to environmental decision making. So first of all, already the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is a 1992 framework convention, it does tell us that subject in relation to protected areas in situ conservation, which is covered in Article 8, it does tell us that subject to national legislation, it is important to respect, preserve, and maintain knowledge of indigenous and local communities, okay? And promote the wider application with the approval and involvement of holders of such knowledge. So indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, as some would call it, it's well recognized already in the Convention on Biological Diversity. If we move forward to 1998, the UNESCO Horus Convention, it's a convention that puts the importance of participation in environmental decision-making, of public participation in environmental decision-making to the forefront. In fact, is composed of three main pillars: access to environmental information, participation in environmental decision-making, and access to justice, all of which are trying to ensure that the public views are included in environmental policies and environmental decision-making. And then if we're looking at a more recent policy instrument coming from the UN Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, we see again a lot of emphasis on including different knowledges. Promoting inclusive societies and institutions for sustainable development is indeed the topic of Goal 16 of the Sustainable Development Goals, but because they're all very much interacting with each other and they are supposed to be holistic, even if we're looking at SDG 14, which is about the marine environment, we still need to think about inclusivity of knowledges and in decision making. So there is this clear, almost mandate that we need to yes, be based on natural sciences, but we also need to engage with and include different knowledges and different views of the public, of sea users, when we are doing environmental decision making. And that's all well and good, but this actually raises a number of questions that I am going to tackle today. So the questions, and I just put a sample of questions here because there could be many more, that arise for me following. Why is the inclusion of multiple knowledges important? Okay, and this question I ask in relation to environmental law and decision making, but you could ask it in relation to you as a researcher, as what Juliet was talking about earlier. The other question is, who is called in to represent different knowledges? And how are these different knowledges brought together in the decision making space? And then the final two questions are, to what extent are epistemic choices dependent on particular ontological assumption? And here is where we can make the link between epistemology and ontology. And finally, as researchers, how can we find out how these knowledges interact with each other, with one another? And here I want to finish off with a note on methods that we use in social sciences. Okay, so if we start out with the first question, why is the inclusion of multiple knowledges important? We can make a distinction between instrumental and normative reasons, okay, justifications of why the inclusion of multiple knowledge is important. Because from an instrumental perspective, often we are told that we need to include other knowledge because often we don't have enough information. Think about monitoring in the marine environment. It's very, very costly. So even conservation bodies, statutory nature conservation bodies may struggle to do always a lot of monitoring in the marine environment. Therefore, if we also tap into local knowledges and let's say of fishers or of other sea users, we may gain a wider picture of what's going on. Okay, so these knowledges help us to gain more knowledge. They also may be helping in terms of compliance rates, because if people feel they are owning decision making, they have been participating into decision making, and they've helped to reach particular decision, they are more likely to comply then with the laws that are set in place, and therefore enforcement also is going to be much easier to achieve. So this, if we're looking at it from an instrumental perspective, but we can also answer this question from a more normative perspective. That is that independently of the type of knowledge that these different epistemic communities are offering, it is still important for them to participate in the decision making, because it is a democratic right to be heard, okay? Because it fosters what we can call procedural environmental justice, i.e. really the right to be included independently of whether your ideas are good or bad ideas, okay? So these are two very different reasons, and sometimes they are brought together when it is justified why we need the inclusion of these different knowledges. At other times they are kept separate. But I think this is really important to think about both instrumental reasons and normative reasons, because normative reasons really go a step further. They bring in issues related to both environmental justice and democratic values, and they go beyond the substance, if you like, of the information. They focus on the procedures and on the right to be heard independently of what you have to say. So in terms of the second question, who is called in to represent different knowledges? this is, again, I think quite a fundamental question to ask, because it's not so simple to say, you know, in marine, but in any kind of environmental decision making, who should have a say, if you like. On the one hand, you know, is it just the usual suspects? So, for example, environmental NGOs, marine environmental NGOs are often called in to represent nature. I've cited before the Horus Convention, which is the Convention on Public Participation in Environmental Decision Making. At that convention, even if it brings quite a lot the public at the fore of decision making, it assigns even more rights to environmental NGOs as the representative of, if you like, of nature. And one could ask, is this good? Is this bad? I mean, and which kind of NGOs can represent nature? Because even the Horus Convention tells you that it's only NGOs that are over a particular number that they can actually represent nature, a member of people. So basically, it's not everyone that can represent nature, and the choosing who can do it and who cannot do it, it could be political and quite controversial. Similarly, one could argue, well, should fishers represent the economic concerns when we're talking about, let's say, a marine protected area designation, or should others do it? I mean, could environmental NGOs also have a say in relation to the economic concerns, or should fisher also have a say in relation to the ecological knowledges and concerns? And I think this then it's relevant, because it depends on how you frame interests and how you frame knowledges, and who can represent those knowledges as well into the decision-making table. Which means that in many respects, there will be voices and there will be knowledges that are left out, depending on who you assign the right to speak, and to speak about what, okay? So think about, for example, urban residents in coastal decision-making fora. Is it right to exclude them or not? Marine citizens, scholars will say, no, it is not right to exclude them. It is important to bring them in. Others will tell you, no, it's only those that are most directly affected by a decision that should be included, and they should be heard. So it really varies also, the answer to this type of things, but it's not uncontroversial, because it has clear political consequences, as well, as I will show later in relation to the marine protected areas in England example. So in terms excuse me, in terms of the third question, how are different knowledges brought in together in the decision-making space? Again, here I make a distinction between what we can call thin and thick participation. So it's not enough, even if we are as inclusive as possible and as open as possible, and we bring in all these different knowledges and these different epistemic communities to talk about a particular issue. How then do we enable these different knowledges to talk to each other? So thin participation will just mean that what we're aiming to achieve is a trade-off between the pre-existing interests. So I have my fisher that is representing, let's say, the economic interest in a particular area. I have my environmental NGO or my conservation body that is representing the ecological interest in the area. And what I do in a decision-making fora is really a trade-off between these two different interests in order to reach a compromise. This type of participation is only thin because it's not trying to achieve something something intersubjective, if you like, something superior. And that's what thick participation instead tries to do, which is really an attempt to move beyond pre-existing stakes and pre-existing interest to reach intersubjective views that really transcend individual preference. Thick participation is what we call in regulatory studies really, and in also political theory, deliberation, okay? So, but how easy it is to reach this intersubjective truth is a different matter. And often then, a lot of participation exercise tend to be thin rather than thick in nature. But that also has consequences that are not necessarily positive consequences. So the other question was really, to what extent are epistemic choices dependent on ontological assumptions? And I think the link between the two is very, very strong. If you may have heard of René Descartes, is a philosopher, French philosopher and mathematician, and done a lot of things in the 1600s. And Cartesian dualism starts really with him, with Descartes, refers to Descartes. And dualism or dichotomies, in the sense that he was the one that, first of all, discussed the differences and the dichotomy between res cogitans, the thinking thing, and res extensa, what is out there. A very clear distinction between the mind and the body, or more widely than that, society and nature. Now, if you think that the two are very much distinct, and nature is something that is out there, and society is something that is in a completely different sphere, then you will end up thinking that also people that can represent societal interest and natural interest, they can have their knowledges about those, are very distinct sets of people and categories. If you have a much more relational understanding instead, in which you see society and nature as part of a much wider, if you like, ecosystems, then that kind of divisions also in terms of who is representing what fades away, and knowledges of society and nature are much more intermingled. So depending on your ontological assumptions regarding society and nature, then you have also certain epistemological assumptions regarding who is representing this sort of fields, if they're separate or not. And then finally, as researchers, how, as I said, can we find out which knowledges are at play and how they interact with one another? I'm in a law school, so myself and a lot of my colleagues start out with an analysis of legal texts and policies. It's desk-based research. And that is definitely helpful, especially if you are looking at it critically, by trying to uncover, in fact, the ontological assumptions that are at the basis of this text. But it's not enough very often, because if you're really interested in understanding and coming to grips with other views of particular problems and with other knowledges, I argue that primary qualitative research is really essential. And here I put a couple of example of methods that we can use in primary qualitative research. And a very common one is interviews with C users, for example, with different types of stakeholders. And they are really, especially if they are not structured interviews, but they are more open, they are semi-structured or even unstructured, they can very much help the researcher understand the way in which the particular subject of study, let's say a C user, a fisher, understands the reality, understands particular conservation interventions or particular conservation goals. Another method that is used often again in social sciences is participant observation, and that one it's requires you to really do things together with your research subjects. So to go, let's say, fishing with a particular fishers, to become part of their world, and that allows you to potentially move beyond your perspective and go into the world of these other people, but it does require quite a lot of time to do so. So, for example, I tend to use primarily interviews because it's something that is more manageable. But interviews will need to say that are a meaningful tool, but also limited in some respects, because ultimately it's very difficult for the researcher to go away from their own ontological stance, their own epistemological understanding, and an interview, the way you frame the question already in a certain sense directs the respondents in a particular path. So things like participant observation or more ethnographic type of research methods are generally regarded as better, if you like, if you want to truly try to get into the minds and the practices of others, but they do require quite a lot more time in order to do so. And also another, if you like, shortcoming of interviews also regards who you are going to interview, right? Who you choose to interview. Because if you think that traditional ecological knowledge, let's say, it's only held by your coastal community or your small-scale fishers, then in a certain sense, you're already biased. And your research is already biased to try to then attach particular knowledges to particular communities and not others. So in doing research and in thinking about how we can go about discovering these knowledges, we need to be really self-reflective. We need to be aware of our own ontological assumptions, which will definitely have an impact on our choices of the research subjects and respondents, and of our own positionality. Okay. So I think that this was just to give you an overview of the key questions that we can ask, especially when we are concerned with different types of epistemologies. And I have, I think, half an hour in total. So I just want to finish off with the example of MPAs regulation in England, which is what I've been working primarily on recently. So I'm not going to bore you with like the law in England, because probably it's not something that is of interest to anyone here, but just the very basics in order to understand what I'm talking about and to put into practice what I was talking about with the questions earlier. So in England, there weren't many marine protected areas except for so-called European marine sites, those that were coming from the Habitats and Birds Directive, up until the passing of the 2009 Act, the Marine and Coastal Access Act. And in part 5 of this act, of this law, they came up with the establishment, the designation and management of a new type of marine protected areas known as the Marine Conservation Zone. And what drew my interest here was the fact that, differently from, let's say, European law on marine protected areas, they recognized that socio and economic interests could be taken into account right at the very beginning of setting up a marine protected areas. In European law, the European marine sites can only be designated for ecological reasons, okay? Under the Birds Directive for ornithological reasons, under the Habitats Directive if there are particular habitats and species in the annex of these directives. but socioeconomic reasons cannot be part of the choice for designating or not a marine protected areas under EU law. Differently, the Marine and Coastal Access Act 2009 with the marine conservation zones allows regulators to take into account socio-economic issues. And I really wondered, how is that going to pan out in practice? What are they going to do to take those considerations into account, together with the ecological consideration? Is this going to be a simple trade-off between socio-economic and ecological consideration, or are we trying to merge the two and reach this kind of intersubjective truth I was talking about earlier? And what actually happened, it was that they tried to do in England an experiment that put participation at the very core. So it seems to be really what policy, international policy and law really push for, that is to be as inclusive as possible. And they brought together the different sea users, they brought together the NGOs, they brought together the conservation bodies, etc., all sitting on tables in 4 different regional projects to try to decide where to establish these marine conservation zones. And this participatory exercise, where you put all these epistemic communities into dialogue with one another, really went on for 2 years and required a lot of people's time and attention, but it could really be the quintessential participatory exercise that we want. Having said so, though, it didn't achieve the results that one would hope for. So when I said at the beginning, why is participation important? And I put in instrumental reasons, so because it helps collective ownership of decision-making, for example, and it enables better compliance. Well, actually, these participatory exercises didn't really achieve that at all. And one could ask, so why? What was the problem there? Why didn't we get what we wanted? Because it was really very participatory as an exercise. Especially interviewing fishers, and I did that in particular in the Southeast regional project, I found out that they were extremely unhappy with the results, extremely frustrated, and they were very much antagonizing the environmental NGOs, they were antagonizing the statutory nature conservation bodies, just placing them into the category of tree huggers that are trying to enclose our seas and our fishing grounds. And why is that? And I think one of the reasons is that ultimately this type of participatory process and project was based on thin rather than thick participation. Indeed, the fishers were called in, but they were called in only to represent the economic fisheries interest. The NGOs, the environmental NGOs were called in, but they were called in to represent more the ecological interests. And similarly with others. So basically what you have is that the various sea users and the various participants were already framed in a way that they had to represent a particular stake that was predetermined, pre-existing, and thought to be unchangeable, right? So the participatory space wasn't a space for deliberation, but was more a space of trade-off. And that is very much also based on the ontological assumptions that we have in the Marine and Coastal Access Act, in which the division between the socio-economic, which is primarily really the economic, right, and the ecological are very clear-cut. So there is very little attempt to think in socio-ecological terms. And consequently, also when you do then, you bring you divorce them and you put them into different types of channels. And that means then the dualisms are really not overcome. And what ends up happening is that people, instead of feeling they're part of a common enterprise, they're actually feeling even more conflictual and more disenchanted, if you like, with the whole project. So, of course, this is just a case study, but I think it's really useful to think about the fact that it's not enough to say that we need to include different knowledges when we're doing, either when we're doing research or when we're doing policy. Because what we need is also to think about the ways in which we go about including those different knowledges, how we ask people to represent those different knowledges, because that has clear then consequences. And in this particular case, it had the consequences that were not the one that were hoped for. So rather than ensuring collective ownership of decision making, what ended up happening was that people felt almost betrayed and even in a more antagonistic position that they were before the participation took place. And ultimately, I think in a lot of environmental law and policy, this divide between society and nature is very present. So even if some of the law embraces more relational concepts, such as the ecosystem approach concepts, very often when it comes down to making particular decision, it tends to be, okay, a battleground between ecological considerations that are in the hands, fully in the hands of, let's say, statutory nature conservation bodies, and the socioeconomic consideration that then should be brought about by the public or by particular users, etc. And this keeps divorcing these two realms, which potentially should not really be divorced, and may impact on the success of conservation interventions. So trying to understand these ontological assumptions that are at the basis of those acts and the way in which then they're implemented, in the way in which different epistemic communities are brought together or not, it's quite useful, also practically speaking, because it has pragmatic consequences on our conservation objectives. And I think I should stop